Our global economy is basically a big numbers game, so there's a lot of power in deciding how these numbers are presented and calculated. If you can change how something is perceived, then you can change reality, which is why there's so much effort put into influencing our sentiment about the economy. But if you can see through the tricks, you can understand the markets at a much higher level than the average person. Let's get it.
So right now we have this GDP measurement that we made up 100 years ago, and it's leading us in the wrong directions. So as your president, I'm just going to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, 100 years old, kind of out of date. Let's modernize it and include things like our children's health and success, which is tied to climate change. Clean air and clean water, obviously tied to our environment. Our health and life expectancy, tied to climate change. Mental health and freedom from substance abuse. All the things that we care about, we actually make the new measurements of economic progress. And while this sounds almost too good to be true, it's very straightforward. You don't even need Congress for this. You have the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they have their measurements. You say, guess what? New measurement, American scorecard includes these things. And this way we can actually put environmental sustainability into our actual quote unquote GDP measurement. Now, this is something you can do very, very quickly, and it's very powerful because you can't make progress if you don't have a baseline. And right now, we have three measurements for our economic progress if you turn on CNBC and the rest of it. It's GDP, which again is going the opposite direction of life expectancy. So which do you listen to? Stock market prices, which correspond to the fortunes of the top 20% of Americans. And headline unemployment rate, which is grossly misleading because it does not include people that are dropping out of the workforce, or people who are discouraged, or underemployed, or doing gig work. And so these three numbers are giving us a falsely positive impression of how we're doing. If you dig a little bit deeper, you start finding all of the problems. And so as president, I would update our measurements. And this would have a huge effect on us being able to make progress on climate change.
Because you'd suddenly see something different.
I'm not a financial advisor.
Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, The Bit Boy. If you like hearing the financial stories that everyone else is afraid to talk about, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more. In this video, we're going to talk about how the metrics that are used to monitor the economy are being changed and manipulated to maintain market control by influencing public behavior. I was recently tipped off about a new report from the WEF, the World Economic Forum, where they are suggesting that the world needs to totally change about how we think about GDP, or gross domestic product, which is basically a measure of the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. This metric is often used to compare which countries have the largest and most powerful economies in the world. I thought it was interesting that this change was being pushed just as BRICS has surpassed G7 nations in GDP. That's the US and our allies. We have about 30% of global trade, while BRICS now has about 35%. China has also been accused of artificially boosting their numbers using similar tactics as well. And this is probably true, but the BRICS alliance is still becoming much more powerful than we are willing to admit. In a report recently published by the WEF, they called for a green version of GDP, which accounts for the environmental impact of economic activity in each country. This isn't a new idea either. It's been pushed by technocrats and even some crypto politicians, as you saw in the intro. There's nothing wrong with measuring how well the environment and resources are being managed in different areas. But that's not what's really happening here. That's why they use it as a disguise. If that was the point, they would just create a different metric and monitor that along with GDP and the other factors in the economy. But that's not what the WEF and their backers are really trying to do. In reality, they're trying to cook the books like they always do. They're just using the environment as an excuse because they know it's good for marketing. Also, this gives them an edge over many countries in BRICS that are in a different stage of development than we are, and environmental regulations would put them at a big disadvantage. There is definitely a point to be made that we shouldn't be treating GDP like the only or most important measurement, and we should be looking at a bunch of different factors when comparing different economies. But that doesn't mean that we need to change the metrics that already exist. When I started looking into it, I found that this isn't actually the first time that this has happened. For the longest time, GDP was just a measure of money generated through the sale of goods and services, but then in 2013, it was updated to benefit tech companies, most of which are based in the US, by including the value of intellectual property and money spent on research and development. GDP is just the tip of the iceberg though. Pretty much every major metric for the economy is cooked. The worst and most well-known is probably the problems with the unemployment rate. Most people think that it's a reflection of all the people in the country that are unemployed, but it's actually only a small fraction of them. Originally, unemployment counted people without jobs who are actively looking for work, but it also included people who are unemployed for long stretches of time. Now, it only counts those who have been looking for work in the past month and are actively receiving unemployment benefits. This entirely leaves out people who aren't looking for work or getting benefits. The numbers here are so bad that there are actually two different unemployment numbers. The official numbers that get reported in the headlines, and then the U6 unemployment rate, which includes the people who aren't counted in the original figures. It makes a big difference too. The U6 unemployment rate, it's 7.3%, but the official unemployment rate is 4.1%. It's the same thing with inflation, which is measured by something called CPI, or Consumer Price Index. This was originally a measurement that tracked prices on a basket of goods that the average person bought on a regular basis. But they're constantly tweaking which items are counted and how they're counted. And it always seems to skew the numbers in a way to make inflation look lower. This is also broken down into two categories, where one is more honest than the other. You have core inflation, which is the one that always gets reported, and headline inflation, which is more accurate and shows higher inflation. It would have made more sense if they labeled the one that got reported in the news as headline inflation, but they did it reverse to keep us confused. They're so good at that. The inflation numbers that we hear are usually the core CPI numbers, but these are not really an accurate reflection of inflation because they don't include energy and food prices, which are two of the biggest expenses that most people have. There's lots of other tricks they play to keep the numbers low too. Like, even if prices increase, they can offset that in the figures by factoring in an improvement in the product's quality. So for example, if the price of a new phone increases from $1,000 to $2,000, but it has a bunch of new features, they can actually say there wasn't a price increase because the customer is paying for the new features. They also factor in people seeking out cheaper alternatives to items that increase in price, which is another way to lower those numbers. They need to play these games because the infrastructure of our economy is all built on illusion and manipulation. There's a lot of trade happening in the economy and a lot of money moving around, but there's also a lot of deception that holds everything together. Public sentiment is one of the most powerful things in any market. We see it every day in crypto with how sentiment moves the charts. This has been well known by the people in the financial industry for centuries, so most of their job is managing this sentiment, whether it's spreading misinformation through the media or official statistics. That's all I got. Be blessed. BitBoy out.